The United States, though we ostensibly oppose communism at home and around the globe, actually have a very detailed history of fomenting revolution around the world. Welcome to American Made. I'm your host, Andrew Muller. Today, we're going to be talking about instances where the United States across the globe has fomented communist revolution. And when you understand this pattern, when you understand this methodology that has been used literally by the United States for over 100 years, you start to see why things happen in the United States, like No Kings rallies or Black Lives Matter or Antifa. And it all starts to make sense. So we're going to get into some of the history. I'm your host, Andrew Muller. Thanks for joining us here on X America News. Really glad to be with you. And I want to give a plug because this monologue, this episode we're about to get into, I actually articulate all of this in an upcoming edition of the New American Magazine. It's called Conspiracy for Global Control. And this is a very special report from the New American. Faithful listeners will know that I'm a contributor for the New American Magazine. My boss, Alex Newman, serves as senior editor over there. And I truly believe the New American is the best publication in the United States. Since 1985, we've been reporting on the insiders, the deep state, the global elite, the conspiracy. And we don't just use theories. We're using facts. We're looking at the United Nations own documents, the World Economic Forum, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, their own words. And we're exposing that there is a conspiracy. The government charges people with conspiracy every single day. It's one or more people conspiring in secret to achieve an objective. And the global elites have done this to usher in, really, as Klaus Schwab, the president of the World Economic Forum, said, a new world order. So that edition of the New American is going to be releasing in just a few weeks. It comes out in May, and it's actually a 30th edition, a 30th anniversary edition of the first global conspiracy magazine we put out in 1996. 1996, the New American released a special edition called Conspiracy for Global Control, the same title, and it went absolutely viral before the internet. It actually appeared in 1997 in Mel Gibson's film Conspiracy Theory. So this is 30 years later. What is the latest for the Conspiracy for Global Control? You can go to shopjbs.org. That's shopjbs.org. You can pre-order a copy today. I would highly encourage you to do that. If you buy, more than 10 copies, they're like $2 a piece. It's an incredible deal, and I have an article in there. So without further ado, we're going to get into this and discuss a little bit of the context behind global events that we see, because this is the prelude, if you will. This is the backdrop behind which our situation in Ukraine, our situation in Russia, our situation in China, and our situation in Iran rest. So we're going to get into that, and I'm going to take a quick sip of tea. Let's get into this. So the United States ostensibly opposes communism at home and abroad, but a close examination of the history, of the track record, of the methods of these people actually show that there is a hidden hand to support fomenting revolution around the globe. And understanding this track record is key. So let's start with Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution. If you go back to early 20th century Russia, in the early 1920s, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. It was often referred to as the October Revolution. It resulted in the overthrowing of the Russian provisional government, which was not communist, and the installment of the communist Soviet regime, which turned into the USSR under the dictatorship of Vladimir Lenin, then later Joseph Stalin. And in fact, it was the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the invasion of Ukraine. That's right. Ukraine was actually under a republic system of government that was independent from that of Russia until the Bolshevik Revolution. So it was not merely a spontaneous or organic uprising, the Bolshevik Revolution. It was actually facilitated. It was funded. It was supported by U.S. insiders to achieve a new world order. So who was it? Well, we had American enablers. These were financiers. These were bankers. On October 17th in 1918, in a letter to the disgraceful President Woodrow Wilson, William Lawrence Saunders, he was the deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So this is not some schmuck. This is literally the deputy chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of America's largest city, New York City. He unashamedly revealed, quote, "I am in sympathy with the Soviet form of government that is best suited for the Russian people," end quote. And he was not alone in that sentiment. California State University professor and researcher Anthony Sutton exposed in his book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, which is a quintessential work on this subject, that there was an intricate web of revolutionary figures, of bankers, of financiers, who had an ambition for monopoly and centralized communism that intersected in Russia in 1917. And at the forefront were J.P. Morgan, who, of course, was created by the Rothschild Banking Company. You've heard me talk about them in past episodes. And John D. Rockefeller, who, of course, was the uh, bigwig behind the Standard Oil Company. Now, Morgan and Rockefeller were seemingly rivals. If you listen to a PBS documentary or read a history book, they're going to tell you that J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller were ostensibly foes. But through their giant tax exempt foundations, when you look at the Rockefeller Foundation, when you look at things like the Ford Foundation, these entities worked in tandem to achieve political policy that benefited themselves, that centralized their monopolies, that centralized their political ideology. Norman Dodd, who was the chief investigator for the 1953 Congressional Special Committee on Tax Exempt Foundations, revealed that he had a conversation with, at the time, the president of the Ford Foundation, who told him, quote, that tax exempt foundations existed to alter life in the United States so that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union, end quote. Of course, the Ford and Rockefeller families fall under that same formula. The Gates Foundation, George Soros' Open Society Foundation, they fall under the same mentality of altering life in the United States to fall under Soviet control or communist control. So Sutton, of course, we met him earlier, the author of Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. He uncovered that Wall Street's William Boyce Thompson, he was the director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, a stockholder in the Chase Manhattan Bank run by Morgan, and an associate of these bankers, contributed $1 million to the Bolshevik Revolution for propaganda purposes. So you had the upper echelons of elites, the upper echelons of financiers in America sending literally millions of dollars, and this was over 100 years ago. $1 million was a lot of dough, into Russia to aid in the propaganda war for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. But William Boyce Thompson didn't just stop at money. He led a mission for the insiders under the banner of the Red Cross in 1917 to Moscow. Sutton uncovered that the mission was not humanitarian, but it was used by Wall Street as its operational vehicle for revolution. He said in his book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, quote, both Morgan's Guarantee Trust and National City Bank, Rockefeller's primary financial institutions, had representatives in Russia at the time of the revolution. So these financiers, these bankers were meddling in Russia to aid in the Bolshevik Revolution, to be able to advance the cause of their monopolies, to be able to access the materials of Russia, to aid in their own personal political ambition. So they sent William Boyce Thompson under the banner of the Red Cross to Russia and to Moscow to accomplish this mission of aiding and abetting the Bolsheviks. So he went, he paid for it by himself. He was dealing on behalf of Rockefeller and on behalf of Morgan. And you might say to me, well, Andrew, that sounds insane, right? William Boyce Thompson, he could have just gone to Moscow with the Red Cross to do humanitarian work. How do you know that the Red Cross was being used as a cover? Well, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State for President Eisenhower, the brother of Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA, he said, quote, that the Red Cross was viewed as, quote, a virtual arm of the government. He said the Red Cross is a virtual arm of the government. So we should not be surprised that such entities under the banner of humanitarian aid, think of USAID, for example, the same sort of idea of going in and fomenting revolution for political purposes. So that's the financial element of it. We also had the agitation element of it, the agent provocateur element, where the United States helped Leon Trotsky enter into Russia. Now, Leon Trotsky, of course, he is kind of the founder of Trotskyism. He lived in the United States for a period of time, but he went to Russia with the help of American insiders to help the Bolsheviks win. He, of course, later became the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs for the Red Army, and he lived in New York City. And he wrote in his biography, My Life, that, quote, his profession in New York City was that of a revolutionary socialist, end quote. Now, while he was in the States, he claimed poverty, but he lived in a ritzy apartment. He had refrigeration, which at the time was scarce and very expensive. He had a chauffeur-driven vehicle, and he exited the United States with $10,000 in cash. How does somebody who's a revolutionary socialist for their profession in New York City in 1917 have a chauffeur-driven car, refrigeration, a ritzy apartment, and then leaves the country to aid the Bolsheviks with $10,000? Very odd. So Trotsky leaves New York City for Russia to join the Bolsheviks. But Woodrow Wilson, supplied him with a passport to get there, which was accompanied by a Russia entry permit and a British transit visa. He left New York City on March 27th and boarded the SSS Christianaford. Upon arriving in Halifax, Canada, which was where the ship was going to cross the Atlantic, Trotsky faced internment for being a revolutionary. And this is documented in the Naval Control Officers' logs. They wrote, quote, that these Russian socialists are interned for being revolutionary agents against the present Russian government, for which Trotsky is reported to have $10,000. So even they noted that he had the $10,000. Now, Trotsky was released at the behest of Western lawyers and was allowed to continue in his mission. Jennings C. Wise wrote in a book, Woodrow Wilson, the Disciple of Revolution, that, quote, historians must never forget that Woodrow Wilson, despite the efforts of the British police, made it possible for Leon Trotsky to enter Russia with an American passport, end quote. So the U.S., through covert means, through the funding of J.P. Morgan, through the funding of the Rockefellers, through the funding of the Federal Reserve Bank monopolies, through William Boyce Thompson going under the auspice of the Red Cross to foment these revolutions, through the U.S. allowing Trotsky to enter into Russia, we see a hidden hand of U.S. support in fomenting this revolution. Now, of course, Stalin came to power later. But if you look at Lenin and his words, he was no friend to the United States. You cannot make a case that Lenin was a friend to Americans. He actually said in 1923, this quote was attributed to him, "First we shall take Eastern Europe, then the masses of Asia, then we'll encircle the United States, which will be the last bastion of capitalism. We will not have to attack. It will fall like overripe fruit into our hands." These are the people we're supporting as Americans through our financial institutions, through our fellow countrymen, and even the insiders up to the presidency, allowing these revolutionaries to enter into countries to achieve an objective. It is absolutely sad. A colleague of mine wrote in the New American in 1986, James Drummy, he said, the Soviet Union emerged from World War II not only with enormous territorial gains, but also with billions in industrial and military goods and technology. And that is so true. If the Bolshevik Revolution never transpired, we would not have the Russia we have today. We wouldn't have had the USSR and the Iron Curtain. We wouldn't have had communism. We wouldn't have had the merger of the CCP and the Russians. We wouldn't have had any of that. And yet the Bolshevik Revolution, which has ties back to American entanglement and American aid, brought us to this point. So once the Bolsheviks came to power, we see Ukraine coming into the picture. Russia warred with the Ukrainian People's Republic, the UPR, eventually transitioning the nation into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which then in turn became a founding member of the USSR. The Bolsheviks quickly invaded Ukraine, took it over. The Soviets ruthlessly subjected the Ukrainians, and they actually even induced a engineered famine on the Ukrainian people that is long forgotten. It should not be long forgotten, but it was horrendous. It was called the Holodomor. It ended up resulting in the death of approximately 7 to 8 million people by some analysts. This is an atrocity, and yet most Americans were completely oblivious to this. Even the New York Times covered this up. Walter Duranty, who was a reporter for the New York Times, one of their top journalists, he said that Stalin was, quote, the greatest living statesman. And he published denials of this Holodomor and said it wasn't happening. He said, hey, the Soviets, they're not invading Ukraine. They're not starving 7 million or 8 million people. He actually wrote in 1932, quote, there is no famine or actual starvation, nor is there likely to be, end quote. Duranty was later given a Pulitzer Prize for his loyalty to the Soviets and to the insiders. So Ukraine fell. It fell to the Soviets. It became a member of the USSR. And then if you fast forward to 1991, you see that for the better part of the century, Ukraine lived under the fist of Soviet Russia. But the U.S. continued their meddling once the Iron Curtain was lifted in 1991. We were involved in multiple color revolutions. In 2004, Western forces enabled the Orange Revolution during the aftermath of the election between Viktor Yushchenko, who is a pro-Western candidate to run Ukraine, and I'm going to butcher his name, Yanukovych, who is a pro-Russian candidate to lead Ukraine. Yanukovych, I always mess up his name, the pro-Russian gentleman won the election, but the insiders in the West didn't want a pro-Western guy leading Ukraine. So they intervened. George Soros' Open Society, which of course has bankrolled Antifa, has aided in mass migration, the drift towards globalism, alongside with the DC think tank Freedom House, which was co-founded by Eleanor Roosevelt, provided seed money for a activist revolutionary organization called PORA, which meant its time in Ukrainian. The Open Society Foundation, George Soros, and Freedom House, co-founded by Eleanor Roosevelt, provided money to PORA, this revolutionary Ukrainian outfit, to aid in the Orange Revolution and to overthrow the election to provide a victory for Yushchenko, who's pro-Western. And they were successful. The revolutionaries posited that the election was rigged. After 2 months of conflict, the election was handed to Yushchenko, securing an ally for Western insiders. So 10 years later, then we had another revolution that the United States got involved in. You had Viktor Yanukovych. I always butcher his name, but he ended up reaching the presidency and became president of Ukraine. And the U.S. fomented another revolution after Yanukovych backed out of plans to enter into agreement with the European Union, signaling that the Western support for Ukraine was fading and losing its pull. A host of violent mobs broke out across Ukraine, calling for a new government. U.S. officials, most notably Obama's Assistant Secretary for European and Asian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who, of course, is a member of the deep state entity Council on Foreign Relations, served as a kingmaker behind the scenes in selecting the new government. After a visit to Kiev, Nuland bragged that, quote, we had invested more than $5 billion in Ukraine to promote democratic institutions and a good form of government. She even traveled to Ukraine to hand out bread and cookies to the Rent-a-Mob protesters. You can look this up. Victoria Nuland, Obama's little Secretary of State for European and Asian Affairs, handing bread and cookies to their version of Antifa in Ukraine. It's insane. Ron Paul commented on this and summarized it well. He said, quote, from the Orange Revolution in the early 2000s to the Maidan Revolution in 2014, the U.S. and its NATO partners have been interfering in Ukraine's internal affairs in an attempt to manipulate the country into a hostile position towards its much larger and more powerful neighbor, Russia. Immediately after the U.S. backed out of the overthrow of Yanukovych's pro-Russian government, Russia annexed Crimea, leading to the present Russia-Ukraine war. Indeed, Vladimir Putin has even referenced the Bolshevik Revolution as his reason why he wanted to invade Ukraine. He said in a speech in 2022 that, quote, modern Ukraine was entirely and fully created by Russia, more specifically, the Bolshevik communist Russia. This process began practically immediately after the 1917 revolution, end quote. So we see the hidden hand of support. And it's never going to be the president of the United States making an address to the nation saying, hey, we're going to meddle in this country. It's always through covert means. It's through the NGOs. It's through the financiers. It's through the kingmakers. It's through the deep state organizations like the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations, these sorts of groups that are pushing this sort of radical regime change. We see the exact same story in Iran, which is perhaps the most relevant of all of these. In the Middle East, the U.S. has stirred revolutions, regime changes, occupations. We've done this in Iraq. We've done this in Saudi Arabia. We've done this in Libya. We've done this in Afghanistan. But perhaps the most significant of all of them is in Iran. For decades, Americans have been warned that Iran is weeks, days, months away from obtaining a nuclear weapon that could hurt our ally Israel or ourselves. But what if America in Iran had an ally that was an actual benefit to us, an actual trusted friend? Well, that's not just a hypothetical. That is a real historical fact that between 1941 and 1979, we did have an ally in the Iranians. It was when the Persian nation was run by the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, under a constitutional monarchy. The Shah took Iran and he made it into a nation that was flourishing. Oil flowed. He built colleges. They had amazing infrastructure through roads, dams, and irrigation. He took a nation that was poor, run by criminals, illiterate, and turned it into a nation that was more Western. Look it up on YouTube. Look up Iran in the 60s and 70s. Women are wearing blue jeans. Men are wearing collared shirts and suits and ties. They're listening to rock and roll music. They're roller skating. It was a nation that was turning into a Western-style country. It wasn't perfect by any means, but it wasn't our enemy. The Shah would come and sit in the Oval Office. He was selling oil to Israel. That was the state of Iran between 41 and 79 before we overthrew. So the Shah was our friend. He even helped fight off the Soviets on our behalf. In A book written by Hilaire de Bure, who is a fantastic researcher. He said, quote, the Shah determined to make Iran capable of blocking a Russian advance until the West should realize to what extent her own interests were threatened and come to his aid. It necessitated an army of 250,000 men. So we see the Shah being an ally for the United States. In fact, the U.S. actually helped propel the Shah into power. Before 1953, Iran was run as a true constitutional monarchy. The Shah was the figurehead, as many monarchs are, but he was constrained. Most power was presented in the form of the prime minister, who at the time was Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, Mossadegh had a top priority of nationalizing the Iranian oil industry, which at the time had been dominated by the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which turned into BP later on. Now, when Mohammad Mossadegh said, hey, we're going to nationalize the Iranian oil industry, we're going to take control of our own oil, we don't want the British controlling this with the Americans, we want to have more of a nationalistic approach. Of course, the Western insiders couldn't have it. So we overthrew Mossadegh in an operation called Operation Ajax. This was a CIA operation that worked in tandem with MI6 to execute the overthrowing of Mossadegh, and that led to the Shah taking more power. Now, after the Shah took more power, he was there from like 53 to 79. And as I said, he was our ally. But then Western insiders started to pick at the Shah. The media created a smear campaign against the Shah. They said that he was an archaic dictator, that he was chauvinist, that he oppressed the people, that he violated human rights, that his SAVAK, the SAVAK, which is kind of like the FBI of Iran, that they were harassing individuals, that they were breaking human rights. You had presidents, you had senators, you had congressmen, you had people, the talking heads in media saying the Shah must be overthrown. He's not an upholder of human rights. And this all came despite the Shah literally donating thousands of crown acres through his monarchy to farmers, raising wages, starting the Pahlavi Foundation with his own resources to fund students in Iran, and allowing students from Iran to come to the West to attend college. Again, look at the footage from the 70s. It was a more Western nation. Of course, they weren't perfect. It wasn't America, but it was far better than the Ayatollah and what we see today. So Western journalists painted him out to be a violator of human rights and not progressive enough. And at the pinnacle of Iran's ascension, the Shah became the villain through this smear campaign and was kicked out of Iran with the help of Soviet-backed communist insurgents. He was forced to leave Iran as an exile, and he wandered from nation to nation until his death in 1980 of lymphatic cancer. Of course, at the heart of this betrayal was the CFR, the Carter administration, and the State Department. Huchang Navadi, one of the Shah's ministers and advisors, wrote a book. It was titled The Last Shah of Iran. And in that book, he noted the following. He said, quote, we now know that the idea of deposing the Shah was broached continually from the mid-70s on in the National Security Council in Washington and by Henry Kissinger, who was, of course, a CFR Council on Foreign Relations shill, and he was, of course, Richard Nixon's Secretary of State. In his own memoir, the Shah's own memoir, Answers to History, the Shah reflected in saying this, quote, you cannot imagine the pressure the Americans were putting on me, he said. And in the end, it became an order. How could I stay when the Americans had sent General Husser to force me out? How could I stand alone against Henry Precht, the State Department director for Iran, and the entire State Department, end quote. So the Shah was admitting in this book, Answers to History, that the Western insiders were forcing him out. And thanks to that effort, the Shah left and the Ayatollah came, and that resulted in the disastrous regime the world knows today. And that's why I've looked at this whole Iran war situation with some skeptic mentality, because every single time the United States has gotten involved in one of these Western backed coups or regime changes or whatever the case may be, there's not a single example of it working out. So I always approach these things with caution. And finally, the last revolution we're going to look at that the Americans fomenting is China. In the East, communist China. This is the regime that has slaughtered 80 million human beings. It was allowed to grow into the global powerhouse it is today, not with the help from themselves or from Iran or from Latin America or from Russia. No, but with help from American insiders. In 1949, China fell to communist Mao Zedong when they were battling Chiang Kai-shek's army and the Chinese Nationalist Party. Now, the Chinese nationalists were our allies. They were our friends. And yet the communist Chinese under Mao Zedong won. Why? How? It was with the help of Western insiders. The loss of China to the communists did not transpire in 1949 when it fell to Mao. It was actually sealed in 1945 at the Yalta Conference. This was the conference that was held between Stalin, um, uh, FDR, and Winston Churchill in the aftermath of World War II to discuss global reorganization. There, FDR promised Stalin the Chinese province of Manchuria in return for entering the war alongside Allied powers. Senator Joseph McCarthy, the great senator who very accurately articulated the communist threat, wrote in a book called America's Retreat from Victory that, quote, if we, the United States, wanted Russia in, we had to supply our armies and force Chiang Kai shek to accept the loss of Manchuria, which had been solemnly promised him by Roosevelt and Churchill. So Joseph McCarthy, United States Senator, says in no uncertain terms that the reason communist China fell to Mao Zedong's forces was because Manchuria was promised to the Soviets, and we had to overthrow our actual ally, the Chinese nationalists. Now, the U.S. was ostensibly and supposedly allied with Chiang. That was our stated policy. We were on paper aligned with the Chinese nationalists, but we made victory impossible nearly every step of the way. We demanded that they enter a coalition government with the communists. We had a weapons embargo on the Chinese nationalists for 10 months. Even John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, when he was a congressman, recognized this. He said on the House floor in 1949 on January 25th that, quote, the responsibility for the failure of our foreign policy in the Far East rests squarely with the White House and the Department of State. The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists were formed was a crippling blow to the national government. He added a few days later, what our young men had saved, our diplomats and our presidents had frittered away, end quote. And of course, this whole betrayal of China was embraced by the United Nations, which the United States funds over a third of the budget, the Dictators Club. The United Nations, which ostensibly says they want peace and love and all these different things, but actually wants a one world system government, they solidified our betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalists on the global stage. In 1971, the UN passed Resolution 2758, recognizing the Communist Chinese Party, the CCP, as the, quote, only lawful representatives of China. We pushed the Chinese nationalists out of the picture. Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist party retreated to Taiwan, where they were trying to govern the actual government of China through the Nationalist Party from Taiwan. But the UN disavowed Chiang Kai-shek, labeled him as an illegitimate government, and recognized the CCP. The resolution also disavowed Chiang's government, resolving to, quote, expel forthwith representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and all other organizations related to it, end quote. This is absurd. And our politicians made some mention of this. In 1971, then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, called Richard Nixon in a tape, which you can read on the National Archives and listen to if you want. And Reagan said to Nixon regarding the UN's vote to side with the communists and distance themselves from the nationalists. And Reagan said, well, that was a bad vote, wasn't it? Nixon responded and said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And Reagan said, we ought not to be bound by the votes of the UN because it's a debating society. And Nixon just brushed it off. Unfortunately, they never stood up beyond this phone call, despite ostensibly being against it. And of course, once we betrayed Chiang Kai-shek, once we embraced Mao and communist China, we accelerated the growth of the country, which at the time was impoverished, kind of a horse and buggy nation. Of course, they didn't have the manufacturing abilities they did today. And we opened a trade detente with the CCP. Richard Nixon did this, opening lines of commerce between the U.S. and China. The State Department's Office of the Historian has revealed that Nixon and Henry Kissinger, of course, a member of the CFR, found ready partners in Mao Zedong and placated the communists by removing the U.S. personnel from Taiwan to normalize a one China policy. This was solidified in 1978 on December the 15th when President Jimmy Carter officially established diplomatic relationship with China and obliterated diplomatic relationship with Taiwan just weeks later on January 1st of 1979. Then Bill Clinton in 2000 gave permanent normal trade relations, often referred to as most favored nation trade status, to China when Congress passed the United States-China Relation Act. So our capitulation to the Chinese, built them into this powerhouse where now they're producing our pharmaceuticals, they're producing our computer chips, they're producing all of our clothes, they're producing all of our goods. And all this goes back to the Yalta Conference, the betrayal of the Chinese nationalists and Chiang Kai shek from FDR and Winston Churchill, promising Manchuria to the Soviets. Of course, the Soviets entered into the war, into World War II after the bombing of Japan. They were already defeated. Russia came in at the last minute. There was no need for them. It was all but won. But this was all done in an effort to advance the cause of the New World Order. So, the history of Western insiders fomenting revolution around the globe, of course, is not merely limited to these nations. We've done so in Poland as well. We've done so in Southeast Asia. We've done this in, of course, all those Middle Eastern countries, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. But for the sake of today, we don't have time to get into all of those. But the question now that we're presented with is why? Why have these bankers, why have these insiders, why have these elitists who on camera, on paper, say they're against communism, say they're for America? Why would they do this? Well, they want to move to a one world system of government. They want to move to a system where the global power structures are consolidated and concentrated into the hands of the upper echelons of the global elite, as was true in the book of Genesis when the snake told Adam and Eve the lie that you can be as God, to the lie later in Genesis where these humans came together and built the Tower of Babel so they could be like God. This has always been the tendency of human nature, to try to consolidate power to rival our creator because of our depraved fallen nature. And that is the history of these entanglements. That is the history of these quagmires. It is consolidation of power, the advancement of communism, the dissolution of American sovereignty, and the concentration of this into a one world system through the United Nations, through the Bilderberg groups, through the CFR, through the Trilateral Commission. And that is the insider deep state. They do it because they want personal, financial, and political gain. They do it because they want to rebel against their creator. They do it because they want a one world system of government. And they do it because they're Christians and they're globalists untethered from Christian morality. And they do it because they're conspirators. And we need to stand up and stop it. And how we do that is by knowing the history. We do it by sharing it with others. We do it by electing representatives who are not ready to betray us, who are ready to, in fact, uphold the Constitution and our system of government, and who will protect our God-given rights and stand for America first and America only. So that is the lesson. If you want to read more about it, you can learn in the Conspiracy for Global Control edition of the New American Magazine that will be coming out in just a couple weeks. I encourage you to check that out at shopjbs.org. There's the cover, Conspiracy for Global Control. I have an article in there on this topic and would highly encourage you to check it out. So that's been the show. Please subscribe to X America News, like and share this. Comment down below what you think. Until next time, keep it local, keep it God honoring, keep it American made. We'll see you next time.